Hello everyone again, this is One-Eyed Willie. Today we're going to talk about brakes. Now before we talk about brakes in more detail, it's important to understand that your tires are more important than anything else. You can upgrade the brakes and your pads and your rotors like I've done here, but unless your tires are able to grip the surface, then they don't do you any good. So again, there's no point in having a $4,000 brake package if your tires aren't able to handle that. As I mentioned earlier, the reason I went with 18-inch wheels on this C4 is so that I could upgrade to a C6 brake package. And what that does is it gives you a larger rotor, which gives you more leverage. It also gives you a larger pad. If you can see this well enough, on top is the original C4 pad and underneath is a C6 pad. Now the C6 and C5 pads are the same, but you'll notice that the contact area is much larger, which is going to give you less breakdown and more stopping power. There's three constants that you're not going to be able to change easily or cost effectively on any car. And that is, first of all, pressure, second of all, surface area, and third, your leverage. Now your pressure is obviously determined by that. So if your master cylinder has a leak, then you don't have constant pressure. And if you want to upgrade, then you can upgrade your brake system, but again, it's very costly. Second is your leverage. The larger diameter your rotor is, the more leverage it gives you to stop the wheel. The smaller the rotor is, the less leverage you have, just like using a wrench. And third is your surface area, which I did highlight a little bit. The larger your surface area, the more the pressure can be exerted onto the rotor to stop the car. The weakest part of your brake system is right here. It's your brake hose. So I always recommend, especially in these older cars, if they haven't been done, is to replace the brake hose. Now, a lot of people will argue that an OEM brake hose is better. I've actually found that this Chinese brand, Sunsong, works just as good as AC Delco. In fact, you'll notice that if you buy an AC Delco, they're still made in China. They still have all the same manufacturing specs. If you want to feel good that you bought AC Delco hoses, then go ahead. But to me, they're a waste of money. A step up from a normal brake hose would be your steel braided brake hoses. Now I do have those on my track car just because it does help reduce a little bit of fade when the brakes get warm. But if you just simply change out your brake hoses with new hoses, you shouldn't have any problem. You'll also want to change your fluid. I recommend, if you're going to flush your system, that you use DOT-4 fluid. This Pentacin works very well. I've mentioned it before. It outperforms a lot of the other DOT-4 fluids, and it doesn't quite cost as much as a racing DOT-4 brake fluid. Since brake fluid attracts water, you'll want to flush your whole system. I like to flush everything out manually. I put new brake fluid in here, and then I flush it out of the driver's side first because it's the closest, to make sure I've got new fluid flowing from there. Then I move to the passenger side front, then to the driver's side rear, then to the passenger side rear. And then after I've flushed everything out, then I go ahead and bleed the brakes. When I flush the system, I like to do it manually. I know a lot of people will use the pressurized systems. I don't really care for those because they do not seem to push hard enough to really get any kind of air out of the system. I've always done it manually. It's always worked. So I don't see any reason to spend the money for a pressurized system. If you notice here, I went ahead and just went with drilled rotors. These are also coated so they don't rust and look disgusting. On my track car, I also use drilled rotors. Now, keep in mind that the holes do weaken the rotor, and they will, after time, crack. So you have to keep an eye out for cracks. Now, they're not as good as slotted. However, slotted rotors will wear out your pads quicker. The nice thing about having either drilled or slotted is it does give the gases somewhere to go, so that you don't end up having a soft pedal where you can't brake anymore. The drilled holes and the slots also help give the brake dust somewhere to go. Now these are the next rotors I'm going to be putting on my track car. I'm going to give these a shot. These have drill holes, but they also have slots. We'll see how they do. We'll see if they protect against fade any better, or if they cause the pads to wear out any quicker. So let's talk about rotors. What's the difference between a $40 rotor and an $80 rotor? Well, as far as the material, no difference whatsoever. They're all gray cast iron. The reason they pick gray cast iron is because it dissipates heat very well. It also doesn't hold in heat. Now you can add things like drilled holes, slots, and that obviously adds some machining cost, but as far as the material is concerned, they're all the same. As far as the specs and how they're machined and ground, those specs are all generally the same. So there's no big difference between a $40 Chinese rotor and your $120 American-made rotor. They're still the same material, they're still the general same design. And to spend exorbitant money on rotors because you really think it's going to help you a lot is just a waste of money, in my opinion. The last thing about rotors. The reason there are torque specs on lug nuts is not just so they don't come off. It's also so that you don't warp the rotor. If you tighten one of these significantly tighter than the other four, what that does is it causes a distortion in the rotor, and eventually your rotor itself will warp along with the pressure. So make sure when you mount, you obviously start your lugs by hand, you bring them up so they're centered, and then you torque them to the correct spec. Now let's talk about pads. The never-ending argument about the best pad for tracking or racing. Keep in mind that you're already limited on how much brake pad you have. And keep in mind that in order to stop, you either break down your rotor or you break down your pad. So the question is, which do you want? Do you want to replace rotors more often or pads more often? A brake pad has to be friable, and what that means is it has to break down at a certain point so that the sharp material underneath can then again cause friction on your rotor. If your pads are too hard, then what happens is they glaze, and it's basically just steel rubbing on steel. So you may buy pads that last a really long time, but usually what happens is you end up having to replace your rotors. A lot of people will recommend PowerStop track day pads versus your EBCs, your Hawks, and your Carbotechs, simply because they're about half the cost. What I've found is dynamic friction active performance brake pads work just as good, if not better, than the PowerStop track day pads. It's a new company, so they don't have them priced outrageous yet. For a C5, C6, these are $65 on Car ID. And Car ID is a drop shipping company, so you'll actually get them directly from Dynamic Friction. Now, are these pads as good as Carbotech or Hawk or EBC? No. But they do withstand up to 1600 degrees, and they do last a couple days, a good track weekend, and they're $65. Now, until Carbotech, Hawk, and EBC pads have proven to last 4 times longer than these pads, then there's no reason to go out and spend $240, $300, $400 for pads. And here's the big reason why. Most of us don't know how to use our brakes right. Most of us don't know how to trail brake into corners. Most of us see a corner approaching and we just slam on the brakes and hold them harder until we're down to a speed that we're comfortable with, and then we turn in. So until we learn how to trail brake properly, there's no reason to go out and spend all that money on racing pads when we really don't know how to use a pad correctly to begin with. Unfortunately, I've had to learn this. I've had to learn to apply brake hard and then ease off as I get into the corner, which again is scarier, but it does help your pads last longer because you're not generating heat for a super long amount of time. So that's about it for today. I hope you found this information somewhat useful. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them. I'll try to respond as best I can. I'll also try to put some links up to the products I've mentioned. Again, I'm not endorsed. This is just what I have found that works well for me on the track. Thank you for watching. Have a good day, and God bless.